You've been exposing USAID since 2014, I believe, that you mentioned to Rogan. It's been fascinating. But to watch this unfold now, if 11 years later, because Trump's elected, he brings in Elon Musk, Doge goes right after USAID. Why was Doge going after USAID as the first order of business?
Well, nominally, it was because USAID was the most intransigent. They were the most defiant in terms of handing over their own papers, their own records, cooperating with the Doge audits. And I think that got the ears perked up from Doge of why is it that this one agency is being so secretive when we're getting cooperation from so many of the other agencies? Why were they, for example, in possession of troves of classified documents as a humanitarian aid organization? Why were senators like Joni Ernst, who were in charge of oversight at the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, being turned down when they tried to do oversight? They were actually threatened by the agency. And so I think that in combination with a lot of the literature that had been published on USAID corruption in the months previous, I had been banging the cowbell, so to speak, on USAID's role in internet censorship and coordinating advertiser boycotts and leading these global campaigns to pass censorship laws in order to target companies like X or Facebook or YouTube or forums like Reddit, all the way down. USAID had this massive information control apparatus in order to do soft power influence so that we could effectively control the information sphere in every country on God's green earth. And so I think combined with the malfeasance that was already in the minds of Doge and their defiance, things escalated quickly when it turned out just how much rot there was underneath the roots of the tree.
We on the right have believed for a long time that conservative voices have been censored, especially on the social media level. I'm wondering now, because of what you're saying right here, was USAID, taxpayer-funded money go to USAID that was then used to do exactly what I'm suspecting it was used for, to turn around and assist these platforms in censoring the one side of the debate, the conservative side of the debate? Are we using taxpayer money, had they been, to censor conservative voices?
Yes. In fact, billions of dollars were spent on this. There's entire government programs at USAID for coordinating social media censorship out of the Democracy, Rights, and Governance branch at USAID, which gets something like $3 billion a year to play with. And some great examples of this are Internews, which gets $500 million a year. The CEO of Internews has been going around calling for advertiser boycotts and the demonetization of alternative news websites and social media platforms who host them. Internews also runs global programs like Rooted in Trust and others that go around flagging disinformation to social media companies and pressuring them to take it down, pressuring the advertisers. My foundation published the Disinformation Primer just 1 month into Biden's term, where USAID under Joe Biden told thousands of its NGOs to push governments to regulate the online advertiser space in order to demonetize disinformation websites. And by that, they mean populist websites, whether that's right or left, but it's predominantly right-wing populist websites in the U.S. and in Europe and in South America. And so you have all of these organizations that have been doing this, and they're all commonly coordinated under USAID and by proxy, the U.S. State Department, who USAID is supposed to serve. And this ends up being the massive carrot and stick financially that makes governments live or die, that makes political parties live or die, that makes news media outlets live or die, and that even makes private corporations live or die, because so many U.S. multinational corporations depend on influencing foreign governments to get favorable tax laws, favorable tariff treatment, favorable labor laws, favorable licenses and permits. And the way that's all juiced is by the bribery money at USAID. This is how you have corporations like Microsoft or oil companies like ExxonMobil that are highly in bed with this whole apparatus. And this is what's caused this confrontation over one little aid agency to blow up into being perhaps the linchpin struggle of the first 2 months of the Trump administration.
Was, by the way, live or die, you miss one, the First Amendment. Well, also, whether it lives or dies, and it was a severe threat to the First Amendment. Was the CIA using USAID funds to influence whatever their operations were?
Yes, from the very beginning, from day one, effectively. USAID was never an aid agency. John F. Kennedy, when he created USAID in 1961, was bogged down in Laos and Vietnam and Cambodia, and the U.S. was switching from a kinetic war, World War II style jets and tanks model to what they called a small wars model, to using special forces and small wars and political influence and guerrillas and paramilitaries instead of full-scale military conflict. Just 2 weeks before John F. Kennedy created USAID, he awarded the Green Beret to the special forces, then supercharged them with their budget and capacities. Just 1 month after USAID was created, John F. Kennedy, as president, launched Operation Pincushion in Laos, which was for the special forces to train and recruit a CIA-backed guerrilla movement that traded in narcotics and was waging the war in Cambodia and Laos. The CIA then took over control of that mercenary army, and USAID became the primary funder of those groups. USAID even purchased for the CIA rebel groups in 1967, purchased 2 CIA proprietary airliners from Air America and Continental Air Services, so that our CIA-backed rebel group could traffic narcotics. At the time, they sat on the Golden Triangle, so they could ship the opium out to fund the CIA-backed paramilitary. It was the same thing with USAID funding the cultivation of the heroin crops in Afghanistan to fund the Mujahideen and later elements of the Taliban, Al-Qaeda, and ISIS. Even today, you see USAID partner groups like the Institute for Peace calling on the Taliban not to touch the heroin crops, the poppy crops in Afghanistan. You can read in June 2023, they published an open letter calling to keep the heroin flowing. That's USAID. USAID was even funding the water irrigation projects to grow the narcotics trades. Now, of course, the U.S. can't claim responsibility for this because that's a major international scandal. The CIA got in a lot of trouble for this in the 1980s and 90s when the CIA got caught drug trafficking for the Nicaraguan Contras. This was the Iran-Contra affair. John Kerry, at the time, as a senator, wrote the Kerry Report on the CIA's involvement in drug trafficking. The CIA director in the 1990s, John Deutsch, had to travel to Compton to give speeches in front of gymnasiums full of a predominantly African-American audience to explain that the CIA's trafficking in drugs was a simple accident and not systemic. The fact is whenever something's too dirty for the CIA, it's now done by USAID. And part of this is because USAID is not an intelligence agency, and therefore it does not require what's called a presidential finding, which is that after the scandals of the CIA in the 1960s and 70s, reforms are put in place to require every covert action of the CIA to be personally authorized by the President of the United States. That way, they could no longer claim that it was unauthorized. Well, USAID does not have that requirement of a presidential finding, which means the president doesn't need to know about it. So if a rogue cell at CIA or state or special operations at the Pentagon wants to do something that they think the president won't approve, or that the president wants to do but doesn't want to get caught approving in case it goes wrong, they simply run it through USAID. So USAID has become the way. The CIA used to do these sort of bribery operations with political, forces in foreign countries, or funding the paramilitary groups or funding terrorist groups, as USAID does on basically every populated continent. USAID is the major terror funder in the world today, whether that's in Syria, whether that's in the Sahel in Africa, whether that's the
Let's take one step further, and that's disturbing. That a rogue CIA cell could use the funding from USAID to do what they want for whatever nefarious reasons. Here's the next question. I'm afraid of your answer. What about the FBI?
Yeah, well, I mean, you mean in terms of the FBI and USAID? Because
if there's corruption at that level with USAID, you mentioned the CIA, you mentioned the Pentagon. If it's the FBI too, where the FBI is supposed to investigate American citizens, and I'll take it one step further. We now know in hindsight that there were cells within the FBI that didn't want to see Donald Trump president in 2016, didn't want to see him president in 2020, didn't want to see him president again in 2024. And I'm just wondering if the American taxpayers are funding a group, a pool of money that nefarious groups within deep state. You're basically saying deep state is real. For all of people who yell at me saying you lunatic, you conspiracy theorist, there's no such thing as deep state. You are defining deep state. And my concern is deep state against Americans. That's my big concern.
Yeah, well, they'll all tell you that. Francis Fukuyama from the Rand Corporation, the policy planning staff, the guy who, was in charge of U.S. foreign policy on Germany during the reunification of, after the Cold War, the man who wrote The End of History. I mean, he's doing whole speaker tours called In Defense of the Deep State. If John McLaughlin, the former CIA director, saying the deep state is awesome. They very well know the structure of their own apparatus. The FBI is obviously nestled in the heart of that because they have the power of domestic intelligence that no other equity outside of a small cell at DHS has the power for. We have 17 intelligence agencies. Only 2 of them are domestic, the FBI and DHS. But the FBI is the investigative arm of the Justice Department, and the Justice Department is the easiest way to assassinate somebody legally. You just throw them in jail for the rest of their life, and you bankrupt them in legal fees. And so look at where all the corruption came out of the FBI. It was around the same foreign policy establishment that revolves around USAID. It was because Trump ran on a foreign policy that differed from both of the opponents he defeated in 2016. Bush and Clinton. Again, the former presidential lineage on both sides of the aisle. Trump broke the foreign policy consensus that had been a uniparty consensus from Truman until Trump. Who was it who said, the insurance policy to stop Trump? Who was it who ran the whole, Russiagate? There was Peter Strzok. He was the head of, and what was his role? He was the head of counterintelligence.
Lisa Page, Peter Strzok, and it went on. I want to expand it a little bit. I think of Ed Snowden, right? So he exposes the NSA for doing some of the very same things, not with money, but certainly with investigating American citizens without the proper warrants, right? And so he says this is happening. He fears for his life. He goes to Russia and he's hiding out in Russia. My point is, don't we need more people like Snowden and Benz? And should Trump bring Snowden back?
I think Snowden should be pardoned.
That's right.
The fact is a court of law found that the program Snowden exposed was illegal.
Right.
And in fact, it was James Clapper who testified in front of Congress before. I mean, they literally caused the direct.
He lied. He said we're not spying on Americans, and then he looked over here and he said something like, "Well, not directly," but they were. They were. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Right. And look at what happened to all of the whistleblowers before Snowden and what happened to them when they tried to blow the whistle on it. Everyone can watch a movie. I believe it's called A Good American. It's about Bill Binney, the NSA whistleblower who blew the whistle on General Michael D. Hayden and the sort of origins of the PRISM program, the very sort of spy index that gobbles up all the data in the world and creates this topographical network map so that everybody's fingerprints can be pulled even inside the United States. Every U.S. citizen's digital information and their credit card transactions, their banking details. I mean, basically where they are, their geographic coordinates at any moment in time. And that when Bill Binney exposed that, the FBI raided his house, took all of his home electronics, took all his cell phones, put him through an absolute nightmare. The same thing was done to basically every whistleblower from inside the system who exposed this. Now, if Snowden had exposed that and it was a lawful program, then that's a totally different conversation. You obviously need to maintain control over highly classified systems, or else you end up jeopardizing U.S. national security. But when these national security agencies go rogue, and you have a court of law rule that those are illegal programs, and only because of the documents exposed by a whistleblower, that has to vindicate the whistleblower. And frankly, it would send a very powerful message to senior leadership at the NSA or CIA or FBI when they are abusing the classification system.
You make a great point. You mentioned Clapper. You mentioned Brennan, Hayden, and there's no recourse. They're pundits on MSNBC and CNN right now instead of being handcuffed in jail.
Right. And you would never know that unless Snowden had come along. And so I think this is part of the reform process. They put, Bobby Kennedy in, who was targeted by HHS, wrote the real Anthony Fauci. Now he's running HHS. They put in Jay Bhattacharya at NIH, the guy who was targeted by NIH. Now he's running it. They put in Kash Patel, the guy who, was targeted by the FBI when he tried to be oversight of it during Trump 1.0. Now he's the head of FBI. This is a very
Mike, and let me ask you this, and we do this. This show is very free flowing. This is not your typical cable show. We're cable, we're digital, and everything. But I'm just going to ask you right here, and we're live. Can you stay after we have a 2.5 minute break? Can you stay? Because I love this conversation, and I want to get into what your life was like knowing all this, where you're looking over your shoulder everywhere you went. If you can stay, if you can't, we'll
sure.
do this.
Yeah.
All right, let's go to break and come back with Mike Pence. We'll be right back. Mike, we left off talking about some of the nefarious things that were going on, some of the people heading these various agencies, Clapper, Brennan, Hayden, and now they're pundits on left-leaning television networks instead of being in jail. You're exposing all these people, and this is going on 10 years. You're exposing what's going on. Are you not worried about someone taking you out because you know too much? And at the time, no one's really listening to you, are they?
Well, I was worried about it constantly. I mean, it defined my life. It defined my ability to, connect with friends, family, relationships. I just assumed at some point in the process something disastrous would happen to me, and I just came to accept it. I think that when you feel called to do something, I think that pretty much everybody involved in this space has that feeling, whether it's someone like Donald Trump or Elon Musk, or even someone like Rudy Giuliani, or people who tried to blow the whistle on issues around the 2020 election. I think everybody who's involved in a hot story, where they know that there are entrenched interests who want that stop that story from coming out, feels the hot breath of the pressure when they are turning a street corner, or when their car doesn't start for some reason, or whatever it is. I think that predominantly the way this is done nowadays is through lawfare and through the Justice Department. I had no doubt in my mind that if Kamala Harris had won the election and the crook Merrick Garland had been allowed to use his mafia Justice Department for another 4 years, that I would have gone to prison for premeditated jaywalking for 20 years. They'd find some crap, like some BS like that. But the fact is it's very encouraging to see what's happening now with these agencies being cleansed. I think that Pam Bondi and Kash Patel are game changers in terms of what's happening there. The mass layoffs are highly encouraging to see. The defunding is hugely encouraging to see. Something may still happen to me. I still get that feeling not infrequently, but this is what I've chosen to dedicate my life to, and I was well aware of the risks when I signed up for it.
Yeah, Mike, you mentioned Department of Defense, which is concerning that they were somehow involved. I mean, we was it $965 billion we're going to allot to the Defense Department, yet they're somehow working with or using USAID. Is it the same reason that the CIA did? Because some things were too messy, they didn't want to get their hands dirty, and they threw it over to USAID? And by the way, if it is, how dirty is or was that group?
Yeah, it's unbelievably dirty, the connections between USAID and DoD. So USAID essentially serves three functions, but they're all the same. And primarily it all flows from U.S. soft power, the idea of American influence into foreign countries. That's nominally what's supposed to be. Of course, it boomerangs back home quite deliberately. But it's on either three grounds. They're serving the State Department in a formal diplomatic capacity. That is, there's a stated goal on the U.S. State Department website or in a U.S. State Department public diplomacy documents. and USAID is capacity building that. So it's either doing something on behalf of the State Department directly, or it's doing something at the behest of the CIA, which is just the covert side of the State Department. If the CIA was folded up and Langley was closed and it moved into the State Department, there would be zero difference between what the CIA currently does. Originally, the CIA function was supposed to be in-house at State, but George Kennan decided that they could not conceal the funds in the State Department budget, so they used the CIA for that outside capacity.
Or State didn't want the kind of dirty work to be in their house, so they took the CIA and put it outside of State, and then all of a sudden CIA says, well, there's a really dirty stuff, we don't want it on our hands either, so let's get USAID to do it. Let them be the bully about. Right.
Well, that's exactly the ranking order here. You have State, and then State created CIA to do plausibly deniable dirty work. In the 1960s and 70s, the CIA got in too much trouble for doing that dirty work directly. So then they created another layer of plausible deniability in the form of USAID and the National Endowment for Democracy and their whole NGO partner sphere. And so you have these layers and layers of plausible deniability, but it's all the same thing every single time, and it's all coordinated through the National Security Council, the White House, except when they want to do something the president doesn't approve. This is why USAID was the main scourge of Trump 1.0. USAID was funding all the internet censorship that was happening from 2016 to 2020. They were funding the Russiagate fiasco, but because they didn't need a presidential finding, and the Trump administration was so preoccupied by what was happening with the Justice Department and the FBI, they didn't think to look.
It's just striking me, as we say, and I only have about 3 minutes left here. I want to ask you, the Democrats defending USAID, I couldn't figure out. Jamie Raskin out there, I just can't figure out. Is it because they realize that the USAID could operate de facto the presidential edict, and therefore they could have access to the things that, even if President Trump wanted to do, didn't want to do, they could access it through the USAID? It was their own little private, CIA?
Yeah, well, I mean, that's actually a great way to describe it. In fact, one of the top recipients of USAID funds every year is Chemonics. Chemonics is a private company that was its founder. Even you can read this in the New York Times, said he started Chemonics because he always wanted to have his own private CIA. And that's I believe the number 2 recipient of all USAID grants every year for over a decade now. And so, but this is the function of it. But you have these Congress critters whose own political lives depend on both direct USAID funding to their donors and to their constituents, and to the multinational corporations who support them, but also to the actions of what USAID accomplishes when it regime changes a country and when it creates these puppet dictatorships who turn over the natural resources or turn over the energy deals or the licenses to their own constituents. You see this, for example, with Jamie Raskin, whose district, I believe, receives an unbelievably disproportionate amount of USAID funding. You see this with Chris Murphy, the guy who is leading the charge against stopping USAID shutdown at the Senate. Chris Murphy bragged in 2014 about how the U.S. orchestrated the coup of the democratically elected Ukrainian government in 2014, and that it wouldn't have been possible without U.S. sanctions and U.S. paying essentially all the protesters there. Chris Murphy, in that same live television spot, said that his own state, Connecticut, was highly dependent on folding Ukraine into the EU by noting that 40% of trade from Connecticut goes out to the EU. And so he had this NATO enlargement, EU infinite expansionism philosophy that his own political prospects depended on in the state of Connecticut.
So one step further, Ukraine. So Trump will say $300 billion. I think Congress will tell you we've sent them $210 billion, whatever it is. But Zelensky says, I only know about $75 billion. Is the CIA or USAID, are they helping, launder some of this money? And who knows where it's going to end up?
Oh, my God, tens of billions have USAID pays the pension funds of people in Ukraine. USAID pays the oligarchs. USAID controls the media in Ukraine. 90% of media organizations in Ukraine are funded by USAID. we fund the unions. You want to know why Randy Weingartner has been all over Ukraine, the head of the American Federation of Teachers, the largest teachers union in the U.S., makes her quarterly pilgrimage to Ukraine? We control the unions there. We control the education system. We control the media outlets. We control the politicians. That's all done through USAID. You remember that Council on Foreign Relations, Joe Biden speech that dropped in 2019 when Joe Biden was caught bragging to the Council on Foreign Relations that they got the prosecutor removed by threatening to withhold $1 billion in aid? That was a USAID bribery. That was $1 billion.
So in essence, they're using USAID to launder the American taxpayer money, and once it gets clean, they can do whatever the hell they want with it. And that's why we can't find anywhere between 125 and 225 billion dollars in Ukraine money alone. It's a machine. I mean, wow, Mike Benz. Listen, I got to get you back here. I ran out of time, but we'll do this again, my friend. We'll do this again. I am so glad that you're not in Russia now, like sharing an apartment with Ed Snowden. I'm thrilled about that. Mike, appreciate your time. Thank you.
Thanks so much.